Hi everybody, my name is Joy Michael Ellison, and I thought that I would do something a little bit different for this month's If We Knew Trans History blog post. I usually write up something for you, drawing from my own research as a PhD student. Focusing on transgender history. But we're in the middle of a global pandemic. I'm tired, you're tired, and I thought it would be nice to talk about something that will bring us all a little bit of peace and a little bit of pleasure. And for me, that's poetry. So I want to talk to you today about the poetry of Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read you one of Marsha's poems. We're going to do a little line by line analysis of why it works as a poem, and I'm going to try to provide you with some historical context for Marsha's work so that you can understand it a little bit better. And then I'm actually going to read you a poem that I wrote about Marsha P Johnson. So let's get started. Marsha P Johnson, as many of the readers of my blog and now viewers of that same blog will know, was a pivotal figure in New York transgender history and in LGBT history in the United States in general. She was one of the first people to resist during the Stonewall riots and was the co-founder, beside Sylvia Rivera, of Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which is a groundbreaking transgender organization in New York City. She also was a performance artist and a poet. And I think that that's something that we really want to talk about when it comes to Marsha P. Johnson, because Marsha is rarely engaged as a person who acted with intention. If we look back at the scholarly work on Marsha P. Johnson, she is described in some brutal and extremely what I would call transmisogynoir language. So that's transmisogyny, so the intersection between transphobia and misogyny, and also the intersection between transphobia and trans noir. So trans noir referring to the representational violence facing Black trans women. So Marsha P. Johnson was subject to multiple experiences of oppression simultaneously: racism, transphobia, sexism, and also ableism. And that's why you'll see some of the older literature that's still circulating refer to her as crazy, and talk about her as excessive and as not maybe a reliable narrator of her own experience. And instead, I think we can talk about Marsha as someone who was a political thinker, who was a performance artist, an activist, and a creator, and someone who was creating in a different register, and doing things for reasons that we can understand and we can appreciate, and engage her as someone who did have disabilities, did have mental health disabilities, and identified as such. But as Marsha said, I may be crazy, but that doesn't mean that I'm wrong. So with all of that aside, I want to talk a little bit about Marsha as an artist. So Marsha was famous, well known in her circles, centering around Christopher Street in New York City, because she would assemble beautiful outfits out of found materials, particularly flowers. She had a lot of flower crowns that you're probably familiar with. And she would use these materials to raise some money. She would go and say, spare some change for a starving actress. And she got that spare change. And then Marsha was a exemplar of what we might call mutual aid, of supporting other people in her same circumstances. She was an incredibly generous person who would give her last dollar to other people, other trans women on the streets, other queer kids on the streets. She gave away her own shoes. She was truly remarkable and hailed as a saint within her lifetime, and as one of the first queer saints. So Marsha, in some ways, was a religious figure that does tend, in the eyes of some people, to depoliticize her, to present her as larger than life, in a way that minimizes her vulnerability, and that fails to engage her as a person with goals and intentions. But when we look at what she did more specifically, especially when we look at her performances, we can see something else that's happening. Besides being an important part of Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary Star, which supported other trans people through sharing housing and food, Marsha was part of a group called the Hot Peaches. The Hot Peaches were a queer and trans performance group that performed at the Women of the World Cafe, Wow Cafe, which is one of the most important New York theater institutions. The Hot Peaches were a groundbreaking, unique performance project. They performed plays every week. And they did so for years, from the 70s into the 90s. And these plays were about opening up space for people to portray themselves as they wanted to portray themselves, to be themselves in their fullness on stage, and to have that celebrated, and to have that open up space for the audience to do the same thing. And Marsha was a key part of this tradition. She sang often, and she also occasionally recited poetry. And one of those poems is a poem called Soul. I'll drop the link to Marsha reading this work herself, and you definitely want to watch that, because her performance is much, much better than mine. You definitely want to see her say it herself, but the sound quality isn't fantastic. And I want to zero in on exactly what she's saying. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So this is entitled, as I said, Soul by Marsha P Johnson. You can count your karma if nirvana is your goal. You can shake and you can rattle, you can rock and roll. You can be a Clark Kent or a Lois or an Alice down a hole. You can be a vampire on a mountain with a heart of stone black coal. You can be a leather angel on a sleek black Harley bike, or a redhead screaming faggot, or a dazzling dyke. You can lock yourself in a closet in a fine mink stole, but it really doesn't matter if you ain't got soul. So let's talk about what makes this poem work as a poem. The first thing that stands out to me is that Marsha is using a really simple rhyme scheme. And this is really similar to Marsha's whole aesthetic. It's like, take a bunch of simple everyday objects, assemble them together, and create something incredible. And so she starts off with, you can count your karma if nirvana is your goal. This is really interesting to me, because this, to me, I read this as Marsha commenting on the place she knows she occupies for many people. She was called by a friend of hers a bodhisattva. So she's like, okay, let me talk about karma. Let me talk about this spiritual life you've assigned to me. Um, and then she says, you can shake and you can rattle, you can rock and roll. So you have this juxtaposition between the sacred and profane, which is classic queer, and also like a very important Black tradition. We really should be thinking about Marsha P Johnson as prefiguring the Black arts movement. Um, then she has, I really love this section where she talks about you could be a Clark Kent or a Lois or an Alice down a hole. I love the phrase Alice down a hole because it is such a great way to talk about, um, to invoke Alice in Wonderland. Um, but what I love in these three lines is that we're not sure what she's saying exactly. And if you ever read a poem, you should have some line that no one knows exactly what you're saying, because that's what gives us this like great feeling of suspension, which is what we look for from poetry. And then in the next stanza, she starts talking to her audience much more directly. She says you can be a leather angel. She uses all of these beautiful, evocative, um, queer images, and trans images. And she uses the language that we get to use, when we talk to our own community, which is so lovely. And then she does a great thing with the closet where she's like, you can lock yourself in a closet in a fine mink stole. And it's not clear to me if Marsha is actually criticizing the closet or embracing it, which is so much fun to me. And then you get, just to me, what is the most classic line in this is Marsha thinking it really doesn't matter if you ain't got soul. There's a way in which I think that's Marsha like claiming her own power. I love it. So let me now read to you my own reflection on Marsha P. Johnson's life. This is from my chapbook, After You Leave the Bar, and it's entitled Marsha, Jean Michel, and Two White Guys You've Already Heard of. Allen Ginsberg showed up to the Stonewall riots 2 days late, wafting through like smoke. Said he thought it was groovy, all those gay boys getting free. He arrived too late to catch a beating. I don't blame him, really. Poets aren't trains, we don't run on time. Not even you motherfuckers who write in rhyme. If the revolution starts after 8 p.m., I'll show up for the morning shift. But I'll bring enough coffee for everyone, and I won't go running my mouth. Andy Warhol photographed Marsha P. Johnson in her blonde bouffant and pearls. Someone else took a picture of her standing in front of the print, poised in her fur coat with flowers and feathers in her hair, an icon in front of an icon, looking for the first time in her life like she wasn't sure what all the fuss was about. Like she suspected she didn't get a fair price for that piece of her soul, like she wondered whom she should ask for a refund. Alan and Andy never went to see Marsha when she performed with the Hot Peaches. I know this for certain because if they did, their art would have been different. You can't stand that close to a flame without becoming a phoenix. You can't become the script becomes us. You can't withstand that amount of love without begging for forgiveness. But I want to believe that Basquiat stumbled into the Wow Cafe, and some dyke pulled him inside and made him eat a slice of key lime pie. I want to believe that he saw Marsha on that stage and sang an off-key duet with her, something about love and home and harmony. I want to believe that they shared a cigarette after the show and talked some shit about Warhol, and that she made him promise that they would cross the River Jordan together, and that some of those crowns he drew were for her. It could have happened. And maybe he would have lived longer if it had. When they started calling Marsha a saint, did it become inevitable that she would be martyred? I don't know, man. I really don't. I just know that Marsha taught tough lessons, like how to survive while being kind. I'm mostly failing to live up to her example. I still play a lot of things way too much mind, and others too little. I'm dreaming of the day I throw my clothes in the Hudson River and float naked down the street. I'll give my last dollar to a new friend, not knowing if they will love me, not knowing if they know how to love me, but for my part, loving them anyway. And if I ever manage to be that fearless, like Marsha, I'll be free. Thanks, everybody.